It's hard not to get excited about a motorcycle manufacturer willing to make audacious motorcycles. Many today will think of the H2 for today's generation, but there's another Kawasaki, the first range of H models actually, that really kicked off Kawasaki's reputation for making crazy sporting motorcycles. As much as the 1970s were defined by Honda's multi-cylinder four-stroke dominance with the CB750 and then all of its sort of baby brothers, there's another motorcycle with equal significance in the history of Japanese motorcycles, and that's the Kawasaki H2. After World War II, aircraft manufacturers in Japan were required to cease all production, leaving Kawasaki in a predicament. Basically, they needed to make something else or die. Well, Kawasaki decided to manufacture lots of other typically industrial products to help recoup Japan's economy. Their first venture into building motorcycles, having built parts for various companies, was the KE1 four-stroke. Unlike most other startup motorcycle companies at this time, Kawasaki did not start with sort of small two-strokes. The KE1 was branded under the company Maihatsu, and by the 1960s their lineup was diversifying and becoming sort of proper two-wheeled machines. The Japanese motorcycle industry at this time was a bit of a bloodbath. It was ruthless. There was lots of people stealing from each other and sort of copying ideas, and the race was really on to see who would come out on top in the 1960s. And while Honda smartly invested loads of money into their own machinery to build their own parts, Kawasaki really leaned on their vast sources of income and eventually bought the bankrupt company Maguro. Now, the aim was to reach foreign markets, especially the US, with motorcycles for young people. This would really define Kawasaki's business plan going forward. While other manufacturers like Honda would pursue sort of everyman two-wheelers or very civilized, smooth touring bikes, Kawasaki focused on performance-oriented bikes, really with a sort of youthful spirit.
Kawasaki motorcycles. All over the world, they are known for performance. High-performance motorcycles that are fun to ride, reliable, and safe.
Now, they decided to go for off-road machines first for the US market with their B8 and B8M four-stroke motocross bikes. These were revvy, torquey machines that would ultimately win the Japanese MX Championship the first year that they were released. Now, Kawasaki's range of small off-road motorcycles did do well in America, and Kawasaki was able to open an office in Los Angeles, but it was becoming apparent as trends and styles among bikes were changing, that these bikes that they did have to offer really needed a facelift. And it was at this point that Kawasaki made a foray into building two-strokes. The previous bikes had essentially been Maguro motorcycles with some changes. At this time, they also updated the Maguro 500 up to 625 cc's and dubbed it the W Series. Now, that's another motorcycle with an interesting history for another video. The bigger 250 and 350 two-stroke Kawasaki's were called the Samurai and the Avenger, which were rather bold names for a Japanese company selling bikes in the US coming out of World War II just, a decade or so ago. The 250 Samurai made a ridiculous 31 brake horsepower at 8,000 RPM, and the 350 just over 40 horsepower. And those bikes certainly helped position Kawasaki as a true performance brand in the West. These bikes didn't sell as well with the general public as Honda's more reputable four-strokes, but Kawasaki was starting to earn a name for themselves. Now, competition to build the next big, fastest multi-cylinder motorcycle was taking shape by the mid-60s. Triumph and BSA with their four-stroke triples, Honda with their four-cylinder CB750, and Kawasaki with two models in the works, a 750cc four-stroke inline four and a 500cc three-cylinder two-stroke bike, the first of which ended up being scrapped because it became obvious that Honda was going to beat everyone to the punch in the race to building an inline four, so Kawasaki shelved their four-cylinder endeavor, at least for the time being, to focus on what would be a new line of triples. Now, Kawasaki didn't win the marketing battle at the end of the decade, but this new motorcycle, now dubbed the Mach 3, it really just spoke for itself, rather loudly. Kawasaki's one goal with this motorcycle, at the expense of pretty much all else, was to build a motorcycle with the fastest quarter-mile time in the world, pure, raw acceleration. Handling? Doesn't need to handle well. Noise pollution? Loads of it. The design for this engine, a two-stroke triple, may have been new to motorcyclists, but it wasn't really new in the automotive world. based entirely on the German DKW triples, known for their incredible power produced at low RPMs in racing. And power wasn't the problem for Kawasaki. It was things like heat maintenance and, well, making sure the motorcycle didn't fall apart along the way. Kawasaki developed two triple two-strokes at this time under project name Blue Streak, a traditional inline triple, and an L-shaped triple where the middle cylinder would be laid down horizontally for better cooling. And though it did have slightly better cooling, it wasn't enough to really justify going with such a radical-looking engine configuration. They didn't know if people would want to have an engine that looked like that. One of the standout features was the car-style CDI ignition coupled with newly developed spark plugs, which basically enabled them to get a thicker, fatter spark into the cylinders. Now, this new 500cc triple absolutely demolished its competition in the area, most important to not only Kawasaki, but most riders at the time, which was the quarter mile. This bike had a ridiculous 110 mile per hour top speed, and the goal of 60 horsepower was achieved and claimed. And then the almost unbelievable 13-second quarter mile time, although some early testers even claimed lower numbers. This bike was easily faster than the 500cc British twins, as well as Honda's reputable CB450. And in the quarter mile, nothing could beat it. This bike was a fire breather. It sounded and felt so different than anything else that was available at the time. And despite some of its shortcomings, it really did manage to stand out. One Italian fan put it this way: the CB750 was your wife, the H1 was your mistress. As much as this motorcycle is the stuff of legend on its own, it's with the next iteration where things would get crazy. See, Kawasaki rushed this bike in the first place. It lacked the proper suspension and frame development needed to really handle its own power, but it was okay at 500 cc's. They'd kept the cc's down enough and the power down enough. Most reports on the big, innovative bikes of the late 60s, both British and Japanese, find that the chassis are sorely lacking in handling in comparison to the power that they created. Once you got all of these bikes really wound up, they didn't handle all that well. Whether it's the CB750 from Honda or the Trident from Triumph or the Mach 3 from Kawasaki, all of them produced 60 plus horsepower, more than ever before, but all of them really struggled to handle that sort of speed and power well. Kawasaki could have left things at that and went on to focus on the 4-cylinder 4-strokes, but they didn't. They decided to take this 2-stroke 3-cylinder platform a step further. Enter the H2 Mach 4, available in the States in 1971, and this motorcycle attained rock star status and quite a few nicknames along the way from various regions during its 5-year lifespan, from Baravolante, which means flying coffin. This was how it was known in France, to the Widowmaker here in the States. And here's why this motorcycle became associated with death everywhere it went. The H2 really solidified Kawasaki's reputation for making absolutely bonkers motorcycles, just as much as the previous H1. Kawasaki does this. They make crazy motorcycles, and just when you think they're done being crazy, they come out with a bike like the new H2 and H2R. This bike really was the H2 of its day, and it was the original H2. We'll talk about that a little bit later. This new 750 3-cylinder 2-stroke inspired a whole new generation of hooligans flying around the streets, making way too much noise and doing entirely too many wheelies. This really was a wheelie-prone motorcycle. Now, really the only reason this bike was 750 cc's, because let's face it, a 2-stroke bigger than 500 cc's is already a bad idea. I mean, look at the 500cc 2-stroke class from this era. These bikes were absolutely insane. They didn't need to be any bigger. But the reason the H2 was 750cc's is because Honda had set the standard for superbikes with this capacity, much like leader bikes today. Do you really need more than a 600cc inline 4 superbike? You don't, but you gotta have a leader bike. In the same way, this was expected from major manufacturers at this time. I mean, you can see this by just looking at the bikes of this era. The Norton Commando 750, the Triumph Bonneville was bumped up to 750, and of course, obviously the CB750 and now Kawasaki's H2 750 Mach 4. Now, this new triple produced over 70 horsepower. There's debate about exactly how much, somewhere between 71 and 74, and this was produced at a lower RPM of 6,800. This was actually a less revvy engine than the previous 500, which meant more ridiculous power available really at any time and at any point in the rev range. Two-strokes run hot, like almost 500 degrees hot around the exhaust port, and this was obviously no exception. In many ways, these bikes were ticking time bombs for overheating. But at the same time, most riders report from this time that if they rode them and took care of them, they could get tons of miles out of them. But who cares? You were flying past losers on Bonnevilles and CB750s and basically everything on the road. Nobody could hang with this bike, whether it was a car, motorcycle. Everyone who rode these said that they were undefeated in drag racing on the streets. And as much as improvements were made to the frame, the engine itself was still too much for its own good. This bike was creating power years ahead of its time with a contemporary frame. In many ways, that defined the early 70s and really all of the 70s bikes that were creating more and more and more power as the frame and suspension design sort of fell behind. That was okay for the most part on a sort of heavier, revier bike, but this powerful and torquey platform, it was just borderline dangerous. This bike would catch even more experienced riders off guard. Many of the official testers for major magazines crashed these bikes. Again, handling at speed on this bike was not good. It had less top-end speed, but it was able to drop a second from the previous H1's quarter-mile time. But above all else, there was that torque. A good amount of torque for this time, but it's not so much the amount of torque. It was that it was produced at a ridiculous 5,500 RPM. Now, the big question for us looking back is why? Why was this motorcycle known for making widows? Was it the wheelies? Was it just a stereotype for a bike clearly a bit more crazy than the competition? Was it because it was the fastest motorcycle in the world? One of the biggest problems, and this is true for many of Kawasaki's crazy bikes going forwards, is just how accessible they were. This bike cost $1,386 in the States in 1971, and for reference, that's about $10,000 today. So imagine getting an H2 today for $10,000. Imagine a 230 horsepower bike with questionable safety and handling available for half the price of a Honda Civic. Experienced, respectful riders knew what this bike was and what it was capable of, and they were able to ride it in a calm manner. A lot of people commuted and toured on these. It's not like the bike just yeets you off the second that you hit the throttle, but as we know with high-performance machines, when they're in the wrong hands, things can get dicey really quick. This bike went crazy at 5,000 RPM. 4,000 and under, it was reserved, it was a respectful machine, but at 5,000, a beast was just awoken, and its rearward-based weight meant that when that power kicked in, the wheelies just happened. Sometimes when the rider wasn't even asking for it. Speed wobbles were also a huge problem, and handling in turns. Some reported also that especially turning left was not good. And if you watch videos today, even of riders really riding this bike hard, you see that at certain speeds, the bike just begins to go all over the road. The power is there for even more speed, but the bike sort of begins to doubt itself. In all, I think that being the most powerful bike of its era would have potentially caused it to gain nicknames associated with death, regardless of its problems. But being a giant two-stroke with power produced so low in the rev range, combined with the whole aesthetic, the look, the sound, and, the fact that riders did die on this bike, the name is fitting. Motorcyclists from this era look back at the 70s with fond memories for a lot of different reasons. It wasn't just because of all the innovation coming primarily from these new Japanese manufacturers. This was a time in motorcycling history where safety was not at all a top priority yet, and newfound freedom on some of the baddest motorcycles to ever be built was being shared across the world for riders. People were getting to experience motorcycling in a new way. People thought motorcycles were fast in the 30s and 40s and 50s and even 60s, but in the 70s, the amount of horsepower and speed that was packed on is just ridiculous. It's fun to read comments from old riders reminiscing about their experiences on bikes like the H2. One rider recalls calling it the Hemi Cuda Eater. You pull up alongside a muscle car and then just leave them in your smelly smoke. Most remember it for being the bike that they never lost a drag race on. Another rider talks about how you could get 30 miles per gallon out of the bike when ridden reasonably, but once you started getting on it, you would drop down to about 2 miles per gallon. The method to stop it from wheel standing was to lean way forward with my chin between the tach and speedometer. I was so far forward on the seat that I was almost sitting on the tank. and then I'd rev it, pop the clutch, and the rear wheel would break loose a bit, laying a patch as the bike launched forward. By then, the opposing bike was already left behind, choking in the wake of my two-stroke smoke. Ah, good times for sure. I think that this motorcycle, more than any other from this era, even the later Z1, set Kawasaki up for what they would become going forwards. The sort of green monster, the one Japanese company really willing to take big risks with their bikes and make bikes that truly push the boundaries. Of course, Yamaha and Suzuki and Honda push the boundaries like crazy going forwards, but especially in the last sort of 15, 20, 25 years, it feels like Kawasaki's really the company that just doesn't care. Now, there's a reason the new H2 was named the H2, and it's not because these bikes share any real DNA. It's not a triple, and it's certainly not a two-stroke, though that would be fun. A forced induction two-stroke, I'm not sure if that's possible. It also looks nothing like the original H2. So why use this name? Well, it's because the new H2 was built in the same spirit as that original H2, and it stands for the same concepts of what a motorcycle can and should be, a sort of willingness to make a truly audacious bike with more power on tap than any other sport bike available, regardless of how much you spend. A unique way of delivering power with a turbocharged inline-4, a focus on pure, raw acceleration. That was the original H2 in its day, and that's the H2 today. Because motorcycle development and production is just one tiny thing that Kawasaki does to make money, it makes it so that it can almost be like a passion project for them. They're not afraid to hurt their brand or image by making ridiculous motorcycles, and they're able to take big risks unlike some of the other big Japanese brands. And as much as I've never actually been a massive Kawasaki fan, it's really hard not to appreciate a company willing to make a motorcycle like the H2.